This is passage 5 of the AAMC Psych Social section for Section Bank Volume 2. This is passage 5. Past studies have attempted to identify predictors of various symptoms experienced by schizophrenia patients, or SPs. Study 1 found that SPs were less likely than controls to correctly identify the mode in which stimuli were presented to them. For instance, SPs were more likely to mistakenly report that information originally presented to them visually was presented verbally. Study 1 was Study 1 also reported that SPs who made these types of errors were more likely to experience hallucinations. So then right here, when they say like something like study 1, I'm just kind of like to highlight something that's important with what they report from the study. And so they say study 2 was designed to test the hypothesis. I like to highlight hypothesis parts. And then that SPs with a better understanding of their thought process will exhibit fewer positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Participants were male SPs being treated for schizophrenia with dopamine receptor antagonists. Okay. And they said first participants were given a semi-structured interview, or SSI, composed of like two sections. So they said the SSI was intended to be conversational, then clinical. In the first section, participants were asked to tell the interviewer their personal history and their experience with schizophrenia. And so then they're saying now in the second section now, so I think good to highlight what they're talking about. The first section, second section, and now they're saying the second section, they were asked to describe the extent to which they feel the schizophrenia affects their lives and the extent to which they think they can determine their own outcomes. And now they're talking about this right here, another skill. A self-reported symptom skill, or triple S, was used to assess the frequency with which the participants experienced positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. Okay. They also took the mental process understanding skill, or MPUS, which was composed of two sub-skills. So they said sub-skill 1 um, was assessed how well participants understood their own mental process, and sub-skill 2 said how they understood others' mental process. Through synthesis, participants rated on a 5-point scale. Higher scores on sub-skills indicate improving understanding, and then like to highlight this part here, and then they show the results are here in table 1. And so that is the passage reading. Question number 1. Which assumption regarding the neurological basis of schizophrenia is most consistent with the treatment used during study 2? So schizophrenia is associated with, so let's go back to, this is study 2 right here, and so let's look at this sentence. They said participants were male SPs being treated for schizophrenia with a dopamine receptor antagonist. And so basically they're telling this thing right here, what's a dopamine receptor antagonist? So if you don't know already, antagonist is something that like kind of goes against. So basically, it's trying to say that it's a type of like molecule in which it decreases the activation of these dopamine receptors. So now we know that like for schizophrenic patients, they're associated with like having like receiving hallucinations or like disordered speech. So if they have like a higher amount of dopamine signals being sent, that means they're have going through like that means they're having like schizophrenia. So it's higher dopamine levels is associated with schizophrenia. So if you have an antagonist, then you're basically kind of treating them with like less schizophrenia because that kind of like deactivates those receptors. Okay, so let's go back to the question set based on what we know right here. So they said A, deficient levels of synaptic dopamine. So we said that earlier that schizophrenia is associated with higher dopamine levels. If it's deficient levels of synaptic dopamine, that means people are less likely to be associated with schizophrenia if there's less dopamine. So this won't work at all. Now, if you look at B right here, decreased activity of dopa decarboxylase. So know that this enzyme actually is a precursor from dopa to dopamine. So it creates dopamine after dopa. So it's an enzyme that creates it. So think about this. If you have a decreased activity of the enzyme that creates dopamine, what do you expect? You're gonna expect less dopamine. And so there's less dopamine, you're less likely to have schizophrenia. And so we recalled that we said dopamine is increased with higher schizophrenia. So B is not a good answer, and so we can move on. And then now let's look at C, excessive activation of dopamine receptors. So now this is what we're looking for, because recall that we said that there's higher activation of these receptors, then you're more likely to be associated with schizophrenia. So I'm going to keep this answer for now because this lines up what we're talking about. Because the goal of this antagonist is to decrease the amount of schizophrenia by lowering their dopamine levels. And so that's what they're treating them. And then we know that schizophrenia is associated with this. So this makes a lot of sense. Now let's look at D. Increased enzymatic breakdown of biogenic amines. So if I have a diagram right here. So recall that when dendrites, it's like this little gap right here. If you at a blow up image, you have like your neurotransmitters being sent from like the synapses to the branches, and like in this direction. So like the longer they're in the space, the more likely you have the effects of like um, let's say for example, this neurotransmitter was like dopamine, right? The longer it stays in this area right here, the more likely you're gonna have like higher increased schizophrenia. So now they're saying right here enzymatic breakdown. So one way to get rid of these like neurotransmitters in the space is either they like go out of the space and then they get broken down by enzymes. And so if there's increased breakdown of these like neurotransmitters from the enzymes, that means you have less dopamine. If there's less dopamine, you have less schizophrenia. And so that's what basically the answer choice is trying to say. They're saying that there's increased activity of these enzymes that break down the dopamine. So if more dopamine means being broken down, there's less schizophrenia. And so they're all going out of this space right here to be broken down. So D doesn't make sense either, and C is the correct answer. And that's question number one. Question number two. Based on the study hypothesis, which construct is most likely to predict participant scores on the triple S? So if you go back to like study two, they said that these patients, SPs, with a better understanding of their thought process, will exhibit fewer positive symptoms of schizophrenia. And so then they're saying for the report, they're saying that it's trying to measure the frequency with which the participants experience positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So they're basically trying to ask us like choose something from the answer choices that kind of explains why, like what term better like explains their understanding of the thought process. So let's go through these answer choices one by one. So it's like a crystallized intelligence. So recall from your content review, crystallized intelligence is something like we take our experiences or our like some things that are based on facts or like because like it's something that just crystallizes over time with our minds. And so as we grow older, our crystallized intelligence increases, and so our experiences become more valuable as we age. And so how does this relate to the question? Well, it doesn't really explain our understanding of our thought process at all. It's more of like, okay, how well do we remember our experiences or like based on facts and stuff. So it doesn't really line up too much of like how to understand the thought process. It's more of a memory kind of thing. If you understand what I'm saying. But like it doesn't make sense at all. So I'm just gonna cross the A for now and come back to it. And now fluid intelligence, it's the same. It's like its copy of crystallized intelligence. It's like it's bipolar, not bipolar, but it's opposite. Basically, it like kind of decreases as we age. It's our ability to like quickly like our ability to like learn things. So it's like how fast we learn things, our reasoning skills, and like if we're able to think like abstractly or like solve problems. So, but this doesn't really explain like our like thought of understanding. It's more like how we are able to like solve problems and like our ability to learn. It doesn't really like explain why like we understand our thought process. B is like a better answer than A so far, but I'm gonna hold on to it for now. And now let's look at C, self-actualization. Recall that from like Abraham Maslow, like his hierarchy of needs. Self-actualization is the highest on the pyramid, and so that means you've received like social report, and because of like the resources we received, we're able to help others with it. But again, this doesn't really explain like just like with the other answer choices, it doesn't really explain like our understanding of thought process. It doesn't really like it just more of like it's like our way of succeeding, but doesn't explain how we think. So as the same with that, C doesn't make sense either. So hopefully D will make more sense. So now metacognition. So now, and if you even if you don't know what metacognition is, you can just kind of like guess based on like the other answer choices that it doesn't make sense. You can notice that metacognition makes the most sense because like if you think about it, these answer choices like fluid intelligence, crystallized intelligence are all talking about like something that increases or decreases with time, and so it doesn't really explain whether or not like their like thought process at all. It doesn't really explain. Metacognition is the only answer choice that kind of explains how people think. It doesn't really like these other answer choices don't really like, kind of go into depth to explain like okay, this person's thinking that way. There's more talking about like how fast are they learning, how much memory have they stored over from their experiences, and like how well can they help others. It doesn't really go into depth of like the thought of understanding. So D makes the most sense, and then that is question number two. Question number three: which construct was most likely assessed by MPUS subskill 2? So there, let's go back to MPUS subskill 2. They said this subskill assessed how well participants understood others' mental process through sentences, participants rate on a 5-point scale. So they're basically saying what type of construct and which allows people to like understand other people's mental process. So let's go through these answer choices one by one. So let's look at A, cognitive dissonance. So recall that like I recall this like term like a couple of videos ago. Basically to give you like the simple rundown, it's like when we have a conflict between two values or beliefs. So like for example, right, I'm addicted to smoking, but like even though I'm smoking, I know that at the same time it's bad for me, and so if I continue to smoke, I'll have like health problems like such as like um, lung cancer and such, right? But then I have two conflicting beliefs because I am enjoying smoking while at the same time I'm knowing that it's harming me at the same time. So it's kind of a conflict between two beliefs. Sub-skill 2 is really like assessing how well we know each other's people mental process. It doesn't really talk about like um, how we understand other people's minds. It's more like talking about our conflict between two interests. So A doesn't make sense. Now B, confirmation bias. And then recall that from your content review, confirmation bias is something like when we tend to look for information that kind of like confirms our own beliefs. Um, this is more talking about ourselves. It doesn't really talk about others' mental process because the participant they want to assess how well participants understood other people's mental process. This doesn't really explain that at all. So we can eliminate B. Okay, C, theory of mind. Even though I don't know what that means, just based off like eliminating answer choice A and B, I know that C is like a good answer just based on the name, theory of mind, right? You're kind of like understanding how their mental process is. This makes a lot of sense. I'm just by me like not understanding what it means, and also because like I know that it's kind of related. This name of it's kind of related to what they're talking about subskill 2. So I'm gonna hold on to this answer for now and see if there's a better answer choice. So now let's look at D, paranoia. So recall that paranoia, it's like when we have like it's like when someone is highly skeptical of someone, like they don't trust anyone, they're always like suspicious of things, like there's always some hidden plot for someone. This is like, though it makes a lot of sense, right? You're always like, if you think about it this way, someone is like who's suspicious would probably try to understand someone's mental process. But then again, if you think about it, between C and D, I probably choose C better because it's talking about the theory of mind. It's basically explaining that like how we kind of understand a mental process. This kind of goes more into like a mental disorder, for someone who has paranoia. It doesn't really explain like the theory of mind itself, rather per se, it talks about like, some like disorder. This goes into more detail, and so I would choose C over D in this case. So C is the correct answer. And that is question number 3. Question number 4. Which assessment used in study 2 is most likely to provide qualitative data? So now if you go to study 2 right here, they said that, and if you can look at the answer choices right here, they're saying, SSI, SSS. So basically, they're trying to ask us, like, which of these following are considered qualitative data. So recall from that, like, content-wise, qualitative data is something that, like, it can be like a survey answer, or it can be like an answer that's not like really like a number. For example, you kind of like take data from someone, explain like, their life history or something. It's like a personal story, and so it's like varies from person to person. And so now if you take something like quantitative data, it's more like of a number type data thing. So like for example, I try to collect quantitative data on the frequency of someone like trying to visit a local McDonald's, right? It's more of like kind of assessing the amount of like times or number of times to like as for like data. So the question is asking qualitative. So something that's being like that's kind of like subjective, something like it's not really like a number, more like of a someone's been spoken to someone else about the data. So let's look at the SSI quickly right here. So this said in SSI, um, it's composed of two sections. The SSI was intended to like be conversational rather than clinical. And so like in a clinical setting, like most of the time, it's usually in numbers. For example, like the percentage of people that are like, well from like after an injection. So if they're saying conversational and they're saying it's a semi-structured interview, so I know that it has to be like qualitative data, right? Because if I'm doing an interview with someone, I'm gonna get subjective data, and so subjective data is usually like gonna be qualitative most of the time. So I'm gonna keep A for now, as this makes the most sense. And now they're talking about the self-reports symptom scale. So they said right here, and this how that works is that they use they assess the frequency with which the participants experience positive and negative symptoms. So frequency is a keyword for like quantitative, like mean that the number of times they experience positive and negative symptoms. So this is quantitative and not qualitative. We can eliminate B right away. Now let's look at C. The MPUS subskill 1 and SSI only. So they're saying SSI and then MPUS sub-skill 1. So they're saying in MPUS, mental processing skill, they said this first sub-skill assessed how participants understood their own mental process, and they're using like this 5-point skill thing right here. Now you gotta realize now this is a quantitative because they're using numbers to kind of assess how well like they understand someone else's mental process. So in this case, it's more quantitative than qualitative. So we can eliminate C. And then if you look at sub-skill 2, um, same thing, right? Because these MPUS is associated with the 5-point skill. So we can assume that based on like if it's sub-skill 1 is going to be for the 5-point skill also, we're going to assume it's the same thing applies for the sub-skill number 2. So in this case, you can limit D also because these two are the same. And so because they're associated with quantitative data, not qualitative. A makes the most sense, and then that is our correct answer. And that's question number 4. Alright, question number 5. Which assessment is most likely to provide information regarding participants' locus of control? So again, like the last question from question number 4, they talked about like the SSI and MPUS, but now this time they want us to like find something that's related to the locus of control. And then recall from that content review, locus control is when something like if it's the ability to believe that something's in our control. It can be like internal or external local of locus of control. Internal is like something when we believe ourselves we can do it. External is the opposite of it, in which we believe outside forces control our destiny. So basically, when you want to find something that kind of matches up with this right here. So let's look at SSI. They're saying the first section. So SSI, and this is composed of 2 sections. And okay, now they're saying the first section, participants were asked to tell the interviewer their personal history and experience with schizophrenia. It doesn't really explain their like control. It just talks about their personal history and experience with schizophrenia. It doesn't really talk about like how outside forces or like their own self-belief and how they cope with it. It doesn't really talk about that much. So A doesn't look like a good answer so far. So now let's look at B. It's the same thing as A, but now they want us to look at the second section now. So let's read that. In the second section, they were asked to describe the extent to which they feel that schizophrenia affects their lives and the extent to which they think they can determine their own outcomes. So this is perfect textbook definition of locus of control because they are asking the schizophrenic patients like how it affects their lives and they're to the extent to like how they can determine or control their own outcomes. Basically, that is locus of control. B makes the most sense. I'm gonna keep that for now. So now let's look at C, MPUS sub-skill 1. So let's look at here. They said assessed how well participants understood their own mental process. Okay, and so they're basically saying understood their own mental process. It doesn't talk about like how it affects their lives or like if their ability to control it or not. C doesn't make the most sense. B is much stronger answer than C. So now let's look at D, MPUS sub-skill 2. They said they assessed how well participants understood others' mental process. Same thing as sub-skill 1, but except they're looking at others' brains. The thing is, it doesn't really, again, it doesn't talk about how well it affects their lives or like to the ability or the extent they can control it. It just talks about how well they understood other people's mind process. D doesn't make sense either, and B makes the most sense, and we can keep that, and then that should be the correct answer. That's question number 5. Question number 6. The correlation between which two variables in table 1 most directly supports the hypothesis of study 2. So they're asking like what is something that is like correlates with table 1 right here and with the study 2 hypothesis. And so they're saying study 2 hypothesis like basically trying to understand that people who understand their thought process better will have fewer positive symptoms. And so if you go back from your content review, if you know that from schizophrenia, people with positive symptoms, they'll have delusions, hallucinations, or disorganized speech. And so right here, they're trying to like, see if people exhibit fewer positive symptoms with that. So let's go through our answer choices one by one. So the frequency of A, so answer choice A is saying that emotional withdrawal and MPUS sub-skill 1. So now recall that emotional withdrawal is a negative system, like a symptom of like schizophrenia. So flattened effect or like loss of emotion. So that's a negative system, and so because of that, we can eliminate that, and then we can rule out A right away because it's not a positive symptom, rather a negative. And then let's look at B now, hallucinations. Okay, I like this first part, it's a positive symptom, and now they're saying MPUS sub-skill 1, and they said right here, they assessed how well participants understood their own mental process. And that lines up well with the study 2 hypothesis. They're saying that SPs with better understanding of their thought process will exhibit fewer positive symptoms. This correlates well with it, and so B makes the most sense so far. I'm going to hold on to it. And so now look at C. I don't know what blended effect means, but I can tell right away from like MPS sub-skill 2 if you look at it. They're saying that Sub-skill 2 assessed how well others understood others' mental process. The hypothesis is more talking about the individual rather than like the thought process of someone else. So because of that, we can eliminate this sub-skill 2. We don't need it. So because of that, we can limit C, and then we can limit D also. But keep in mind, delusion is also another like positive symptom right here. Delusions, it's like when we have like a fixed, idea of something. But regardless, even if it was a positive like symptom, this still be wrong because of the subskill two. Subskill two is focused on like others' mental process rather than the individual. So we can limit D, and this leaves B as our best answer choice. And that's question number 6. Question number 7. Which type of memories are most likely to be reported in response to the SSI, or the semi-structured interview? So they said in this like interview, they had participants, they were asked to tell the interviewer their personal story, like, or history, and their experience with schizophrenia. And then the last section, they just talked about like how they kind of dealt with it and coped with it, or like their locus of control basically. So now let's go back to the answer choices, kind of explain like what type of memories are being reported, like when they're explaining their personal history. So now, A, flashbulb memory. So if I have like a diagram right here, I'll pull up. So if, recall that like flashbulb memory is like something that's like a vivid or detailed memory, and it's like this happens like during like a highly emotional event. So like for example, Princess Diana, right? When she died, it was considered a very emotional event, and people like reported that they can describe a vivid and detailed memory of like when it happened, basically. And so this is usually like from someone from their own personal experience, like beforehand. So flashbulb memory, if you think about, you can probably get this from someone like when they're trying to recall their personal history from their experience or their lifetime about schizophrenia. They're recalling like a vivid or like a detailed memory, and so flashbulb will make the most sense based on that. So we can keep answer choice A so far. And now if you look at B, implicit is something we do on like unconsciously, right? For example, like let's say I was driving like a motorcycle. I don't need that much like, conscious effort to like ride the motorcycle. My body just kind of does it automatically. And so this is kind of implicit. So it's like, we just do unconsciously without need that much effort to do something. So, but thing is though, they're talking about like they're asking what type of memory is this, and they're recalling their personal history. This takes some effort or conscious to recall. It's not really something we do unconsciously and tell someone. So B is not the correct answer. Now C, it's very similar to B in such that procedural like memory is part of implicit memory. And so I gave the example earlier with the bike where like, if I'm riding like a motorcycle, my procedural memory is taking over. So I'm unconsciously like riding the bike. So I don't need that much conscious effort to control the bike while I'm driving. So it's the same thing as B, and so we can limit C as well. And now if you look at D, semantic memory is, so a lot of people might get this confused, mixed up because they're kind of like saying facts or something, right? Something they know. Like for example, um, who's the 45th of the president, like if, like 45th of president of the United States, right? Um, this is something that people will call as general knowledge, but you gotta realize something, that this is coming from someone telling their personal history and their experience. This is not more, it's not really like a fact per se. It's rather just someone's memory. In this case, they were calling detailed memory, so it's more similar to a flashbulb memory than a semantic memory. Semantic memory, you want to always remember that it has to do with general knowledge or facts. This doesn't really apply to like what the person's trying to tell the interviewer here. So D doesn't make sense, and A is the correct answer. And that's question number 7. And that's the end of passage 5 right here.